Under a sky the color of faded steel, the Black Hills rise like an old memory trying to take form. Pines lean into the wind, whispering across one another, and every breath of air carries the faint taste of dust and resin. Nothing here moves quickly. The land seems to breathe at its own pace, slow, patient, ancient. From a distance, the ridgelines look asleep, folded and furred with trees, but those who have walked them long enough say the ground listens. They say when the wind shifts just right, you can hear a rhythm that doesn't belong to weather, a slow, deliberate exhale, like the earth remembering itself. Granite outcrops push through the soil in shapes too deliberate to feel accidental. The Lakota once called these stones the bones of the world, and even the cavalry scouts who mapped them a century later felt uneasy when their horses refused to step between certain pillars of rock. In the small hours before dawn, mist gathers there, thick enough to blur compass bearings and deaden sound. The forest floor smells of rain that hasn't fallen in weeks, and the air carries that stillness peculiar to places that have seen too much to explain. The locals don't talk about ghosts, not directly, but their stories circle something that never fully went quiet. At night, the silence deepens until it feels heavy, like the pause between heartbeats. Old miners spoke of campfires that burned blue at the edge of the tree line. Hunters tell of footprints that appear in dew, leading nowhere, too deep for a single man to have left. It's easy to dismiss these tales as frontier superstition. Until you spend a few nights alone here, the stillness begins to feel conscious, as though the land itself is watching, waiting, breathing in sync with you. There's no single legend that explains the Black Hills, no one ghost that owns its name. Instead, there's a slow accumulation of stories, each one a fragment of something larger, something the soil has chosen to keep. It's said that sound travels strangely here. A man can call from one ridge and hear his own echo answer from behind him, reshaped and delayed. Some claim it's the geography, the way granite bends and traps air. Others call it by a simpler name, the echo of the forgotten. Whatever it is, it has persisted through every generation that set foot on this ground. As the narrator's voice softens, the forest becomes a study in stillness, the kind that doesn't calm, but quiets. The audience feels that peculiar mix of peace and unease, the awareness of being a guest in something older than memory. The wind threads through the pines like slow breath, the same breath that once filled the lungs of men who fought and fell here, unmarked and unnamed. The hills are sleeping, yes, but in their sleep they remember. No maps mark this battlefield. It exists only in fragments, a handful of letters, a weathered cartridge casing found beneath a pine root, a diary page that survived because someone used it to wrap tobacco. The official reports from that season list no engagements in this sector of the Black Hills. Yet, every spring, when the rains come and the soil softens, bones rise through the earth like old memories that refuse burial. Some still bear the faint green of tarnished brass. Others crumble at the touch, their shapes indistinguishable from the stone around them. Locals say it happened in the late 1870s. Sometime after the campaign, trails had grown cold, but before the treaties were finally broken. A detachment of cavalry rode north from Fort Meade, pursuing what the records call unidentified hostiles. None returned. Weeks later, a relief party followed the route, finding only shattered gear and burnt canvas among the trees. No one spoke officially of the skirmish afterward. It was easier to erase what could not be explained. Over time, the forest reclaimed the slope. Saplings took root in shallow graves, and moss crept over the metal fragments until they lost their shine. The wind carried away what gunfire might have sounded like, replacing it with the constant hush of pine needles brushing one another, the sound of nature resuming its watch. Now, hikers pass within meters of that forgotten clearing, without ever knowing where they stand. There are still traces for those who know where to look. A depression in the soil shaped like a trench, the faint ridge of an old wagon path that appears only under certain light. When storms roll across the hills, lightning sometimes strikes the same ridge twice, as if guided by something beneath the surface. The old ranchers call it the iron vein. Historians have other names for it: mineral conduction, soil resonance, but none can deny the pattern. It is a battlefield that doesn't appear on paper, a silence written into geography itself. Every raindrop that falls there uncovers the same truth. That history, when buried too quickly, has a way of breathing back through the ground. In the archives of Fort Meade, there is a gap that no clerk could ever explain. A week missing from the dispatch logs of the 7th Cavalry's frontier patrols. The ink on either side of that gap remains crisp and legible, the handwriting steady, the chain of command unbroken. But for those 7 days, nothing exists. The patrol was listed as en route for reconnaissance, and then, abruptly, awaiting reassignment. No casualties, no return, no explanation. It is as though a regiment simply dissolved into the hills, carried off by wind and silence. Later inventories show equipment missing, rifles, a standard, a signal drum, all recorded as lost in transport. When historians retraced the paperwork, they found overlapping signatures, stamps out of order, and a burned corner in one ledger that had blackened the name of the commanding officer. Some suggested clerical error, others intentional omission. The deeper one digs into the records, the clearer the absence becomes. It isn't just a missing report, it's a decision to forget. Only one account remains in human handwriting. A letter from a scout named William Reeves, dated June 12, 1879, and never officially filed. It surfaced decades later in a private collection, the edges flaked with dust, the ink faded to a pale brown. Reeves wrote to his brother in Nebraska, a short, uneven letter that began without greeting. The hills were breathing that night. We thought it was fog rolling in, but it moved against the wind. When we halted to listen, it stopped. I can't say what it was, only that the horses wouldn't step forward. Captain told us to light the lamps and check bearings. That was the last order I heard. The letter ends abruptly. No signature, no date beyond the first. On the back, in faint pencil, someone, perhaps his brother, perhaps an archivist, had written a single note. Never returned. Everything about this disappearance feels deliberate, curated by someone who understood that erasure can sometimes be cleaner than explanation. But the land remembers what the ledgers refuse. Each generation of surveyors and historians encounters the same strange vacuum in the record, as if the ground itself had swallowed the facts. The regiment without a record became a rumour, and the rumour became a silence that stretches from the archives all the way to the tree line. Even now that silence feels inhabited, as though the missing have found their own way to keep watch. The night engagement began without fanfare. No bugle, no cry, just the soft percussion of hooves on pine needles and the sound of wind flattening the grass. The moon was thin, caught in a halo of mist that hung over the ridgeline. Men whispered orders that died before reaching their targets. When the first shot cracked through the silence, no one could say who fired it. A muzzle flash blinked somewhere ahead, and the forest responded with chaos. Reeves wrote that the air moved like a living thing, the smoke folding and unfolding around them until direction lost meaning. Lanterns threw pale light that hit only trees, and between those trunks, movement. Too quick, too fluid to be human. They fired into the dark, into the suggestion of shapes. Bullets struck bark, stone, and something that made no sound at all. Reeves wrote, they fired at shapes that didn't bleed. Horses screamed and tore their reins loose, bolting toward the deeper woods. A corporal called for retreat, but his voice dissolved into echo. The men regrouped by instinct, back to back, guns trembling. Then came the sound, what Reeves described as a breath rolling through the valley, steady, immense. It wasn't wind, he said. It was as if the land exhaled and everything else forgot to. The smoke shifted with it, carrying sparks that floated like lanterns over invisible heads. For a moment, the forest glowed as though lit from below. No one saw the enemy clearly. Some reported arrows in the trees, but when recovered later, none showed marks of use. Others swore they heard drums, yet no rhythm matched the native cadence they knew. The sound faded as quickly as it came, replaced by the brittle crack of cooling rifle barrels. When dawn arrived, the fog retreated to the ravines, leaving the field empty except for overturned packs and the impression of footprints, deep, parallel, and facing in both directions at once. Reeves's last line is short, unsteady. When it was over, we counted fewer voices than faces. The company was gone by sunrise. What the survivors carried back to camp was not victory, not defeat, but uncertainty. The kind that follows a man home and waits by the door each night. And long after the last body was buried, the pines continued to sway, as if still keeping rhythm with that breath no one could name. When the soldiers who survived the Black Hills returned home, they brought little with them. No medals, no records, not even the certainty that they had fought a real battle. Most avoided questions altogether. In letters and diaries, their families described them as quiet men, prone to waking suddenly in the night, listening to something no one else could hear. They would sit for hours on the porch, staring into the dark as if waiting for a sound to return. One wife wrote that her husband would sometimes whisper commands into the wind, then nod as though an unseen voice had answered. By the turn of the century, these symptoms found a name in the new language of military medicine, the Wraith condition. Doctors in Fort Meade's infirmary used the term to describe veterans who reported hearing rhythmic breathing or soft voices in patterns of wind. They diagnosed it as an acoustic memory, a residual echo of battlefield trauma that the brain could not silence. One physician noted that when a storm passed through, several patients simultaneously reported the same phrase, "Hold the line." It was dismissed as coincidence, an auditory hallucination born of shared experience, but the records suggest these men had never met. Local ranchers told a different story. They said the hills were speaking back. When the wind moved from south to north, they claimed it carried voices, low, drawn out, heavy with breath. Some nights it sounded like commands, others like prayers. A few refused to camp in certain valleys altogether, saying the air there had too much memory. Even decades later, hunters reported hearing bootsteps pacing behind them, matching their stride, stopping when they stopped. The old-timers told them not to answer back. Doctors said it was trauma. Locals said it was the land. Between those two beliefs lies the shape of the story itself. A nation learning that war never truly ends, it just changes its medium. The soldiers' minds had become instruments, still tuned to a battlefield that time had erased. They heard what others couldn't, because part of them was still standing on that ridge, listening for the next order. In the archives, the case notes remain clinical, detached, but between the lines, something human flickers. Loneliness, guilt, and the strange comfort of familiar ghosts. The Wraith condition wasn't a haunting in the old sense. It was the sound of memory refusing to fade. More than a century after Reeves's patrol vanished, the Black Hills drew a different kind of visitor. Not soldiers this time, but investigators. Quiet, methodical people armed with microphones instead of rifles. They came to measure what the locals called the hum, a low vibration that rolled through the valley on windless nights. At first, they suspected mining equipment or power lines, but the nearest grid was miles away. They set up their recorders at dusk, spacing them along the ridgeline where the old maps ended. Each night, they logged the same frequency, barely audible, somewhere between heartbeat and breath. The data showed patterns that no geological model could explain. The hum rose and fell in intervals, like speech without consonants. One technician described it as breathing translated into sound. When they filtered the recordings through Spectrum software, faint distortions appeared, waves folding over one another in rhythmic bursts. The team agreed it was too structured to be random, but too irregular to be mechanical. Still, they avoided speculation. Scientific method required restraint. On the third night, the recorder picked up marching. Faint, uneven, distant, boots on soft ground, moving from west to east. Every device captured it at the same moment, though the team members themselves heard nothing in real time. The audio log notes the confusion. 03:17 a.m., synchronized impact pattern, 14 steps. Fades left. They replayed it through headphones, expecting overlap from nearby campers or animals. There were none. The valley had been empty for miles. Later analysis revealed that the pattern of steps matched the cadence of 19th century infantry drill, specifically the 7th Cavalry's standard pace. That discovery circulated briefly among online forums before being dismissed by experts as coincidence, another case of auditory pareidolia. Yet, those who listened closely said the sound carried weight, as if each footfall pressed against the present. No one declared it proof of haunting. The investigators simply filed their findings under unresolved anomaly. But in the calm replay of that third night's audio, the listener can almost feel the ridge exhale, like a great lung stirring beneath the trees, releasing fragments of an order no one has spoken for more than 100 years. The Fort Meade archives hold more than dispatches and requisitions. In a narrow drawer labelled Medical Irregularities, 1879 to 1883, a thin folder sits beneath dust the colour of parchment. Its tag reads simply, Incident 43B. The cover bears the faint watermark of the War Department and a red stamp marked "Restricted." The report was found decades later during a routine cataloguing effort, its spine warped from moisture, several pages missing. What remains tells a story in the language of bureaucracy. Dry, exact, and unnervingly calm, the surviving summary describes a psychological contagion of undetermined origin affecting patrols stationed in the northern sector of the Black Hills. Symptoms included auditory distortion, collective hallucination, and episodes of synchronized distress. Witness statements were brief and heavily redacted. One line, preserved in full, reads, "The men reported the sense of being addressed by the environment." The phrasing is clinical, but the meaning feels ancient, something in the landscape communicating through sound or pressure. Further, notes mention the withdrawal of 3 patrols due to loss of operational clarity. The report's author, Captain Elias Ward, recommended temporary quarantine of the affected area, noting that unrecorded stimuli might induce panic if left unmonitored. He suggested suspending further mapping operations until winter. The final page lists his signature and a date, September 3rd, 1879, followed by an empty field where the approving officer's name should be. Ward's correspondence ends there. 2 months later, a replacement officer filed a short memo. Captain Ward presumed missing during routine transfer to Fort Randall. No remains were ever found. The file carries a handwritten note in the margin. Transfer incomplete, assumed administrative error. When archivists rediscovered the report in the 1970s, they noted an odd pattern, faint impressions on the missing pages, as though someone had pressed hard while writing, then torn them out. Under angled light, a few words can still be read. Resonance field, containment perimeter, sleeping. The rest is gone, erased by time or intent. It is the kind of document that resists closure. Factual yet suggestive. Its omissions louder than what survives. The Fort Meade logbook lists Incident 43B as resolved, but no subsequent patrols were ever assigned to that ridge again. On paper, the silence was sealed. In the hills, it kept breathing. In 1974, an Army historian named Daniel Corr was assigned to reclassify outdated medical reports for archival storage. Among the boxes delivered to his desk was the thin folder marked Fort Meade, Incident 43B. At first, it seemed no different from the others. Yellowed paper, brittle clips, signatures from officers long dead. But the more Corr read, the more the file unsettled him. The language was too measured for panic, yet too vague for protocol. He began to annotate the margins in pencil, tracing patterns between phrases, circling dates, and underlining the repeated word resonance. Corr's early notes are neat, clinical. Possible case of auditory mirage phenomena, similar to infrasound-induced delusion. He links it to low-frequency vibrations produced by certain geological formations. In the following pages, his tone shifts. He questions how the same symptoms appeared in multiple patrols separated by weeks. He draws arrows between scattered references to breathing, fog, and sound. His handwriting grows smaller, pressed harder into the paper. By his 5th page of annotations, his professionalism gives way to fascination. He writes, cross-referencing with oral histories. Same location described as hill that exhales. Must consider cultural data. Then, in parentheses, pattern of communication. Sequence? The last word is double underlined. The final page of his notes bears the sentence, "They spoke in sequence." After that, the handwriting weakens, fading into light impressions that can only be read under infrared scan. The archivists who later reviewed his papers found faint indentations suggesting unfinished words. The ranger had worked those hills long enough to know their ordinary sounds. The scrape of deer hooves on shale, the soft complaint of wind against wire, the way trees clicked when frost began to settle. Nothing about that place startled him anymore. Yet for 3 months in early autumn, the motion sensors on the North Ridge began to trigger in the same pattern every night. 3 beeps, pause, 2 beeps. Each time he arrived, the clearing was empty. At first he blamed animals, elk, maybe, wind. But the recordings showed something different. Small heat signatures moving in formation, evenly spaced, crossing the field from east to west. When he walked it in daylight, he found no tracks, no broken branches, not even disturbed grass. The ground seemed untouched, as though whatever passed through had done so without weight. The first radio interference came a week later. While checking the sensor line, his radio hissed, then opened into a channel he hadn't tuned. Through the static came a voice, faint, clipped, formal. "Hold the line." It repeated twice before fading into nothing. He stood there in the dark, breath visible, the pine shadows stretching like bars across his boots. When he reported it, the technicians chalked it up to cross-channel bleed, but the phrase lingered. Over the following nights, the interference grew stranger. Words mixed with the static, numbers, unit codes, fragments of what sounded like field orders. He began recording them out of habit, labeling each file by date and time. On playback, the voices were clear enough to transcribe. Some of the phrases matched entries in the 19th century cavalry logs he'd read in the visitor center display. "Advance by 2. Check the ridge. Hold the line." He never told the tourists about it. He didn't tell the park office either. He just kept the recordings on a single drive, locked in a drawer with his logbook. To him, it didn't feel like haunting. It felt like duty echoing forward. Men who had died still performing the only order they'd ever known. When the sensors triggered again, he no longer hurried to the site. He would stand on the porch instead, listening to the soft beeping drift through the forest, a sound half mechanical, half heartbeat, marking time for those still on watch. He hadn't planned to stop in the Black Hills. The hiker, an amateur photographer on his way north toward Badlands, pulled off the highway to stretch his legs and wander the tree line. The air was cooler than expected, thick with the smell of pine sap and wet stone. He followed a faint trail that curved along a ridge, its edges marked by old wire fence posts that no longer held any wire. The forest felt empty but not silent, the kind of quiet that seemed to lean in when you moved too fast. Near a stand of fallen trees, something metallic caught his eye. A dull glint half buried in the soil. He knelt, brushing away needles and mud until small objects surfaced. Rusted buttons, the rim of a bullet casing, a tiny silver locket sealed with dirt. The locket's hinge resisted, then gave. Inside was a faded photograph, barely visible. A man in uniform with no insignia left. The hiker took a picture, pocketed the find, and turned on his recorder to capture ambient sound for a travel blog he kept. That's when he heard it. A low hum, steady and pulsing, like air moving through a pipe somewhere underground. He circled the area, holding the recorder at arm's length. The hum stayed constant, neither louder nor fainter. Then, faintly, beneath the drone, came a pattern. 3 beats, pause, 2 beats. He waited, certain it was an echo of his own breath. But it continued long after he stopped moving. The sound lasted for nearly 2 minutes before slipping back into silence. He played it again on his phone. The hum was gone, replaced by a faint rhythmic distortion that made the speakers tremble. Later that night, reviewing the track in his tent, he noticed something else. His GPS unit, kept on only to track elevation, showed a single saved waypoint blinking on the screen. Engagement Site A. He had never entered it, never marked anything by that name. The coordinates matched the ridge where he'd found the locket. He deleted the file the next morning but couldn't shake the sense that the ground had marked itself. Even months later, back home, his phone occasionally glitched to that same location, the ghost of a signal still waiting for someone to answer back. Scientists once believed that sound vanished the moment it was heard, vibration dissolving into air. But newer acoustic studies have suggested a slower kind of persistence. Under the right conditions, sound can etch itself into the world. Pressure waves travel through soil, rock, even tree bark, embedding traces of their motion in microscopic shifts of structure. In theory, the earth remembers. It holds every footstep, every rifle crack, every whisper ever spoken to it, stored as patterns too small for human ears. Geologists call these traces acoustic fossils, vibrations trapped in minerals that respond like memory to temperature or pressure changes. Over centuries, wind and erosion can release them again, reshaped into tones and murmurs. To those who have stood in the Black Hills during a windless dusk, this idea feels less like science fiction and more like recognition. The hum, the echoes, the strange pulse in the air. Perhaps none of it is supernatural. Perhaps it is the land replaying what it was made to hear. Every echo is a memory trying to return. When soldiers fired their weapons, when their horses pounded the soil, when the dying whispered for water, those sounds entered the granite and pine. Layer upon layer, decade after decade, the hills became a kind of living archive. The silence that followed wasn't emptiness. It was the long breath of memory, holding until someone came close enough to listen again. Some researchers have suggested that seismic sensors could someday capture these ancient reverberations, translating them into recognizable frequencies, turning stone back into story. But perhaps that translation already happens. Not through machines, but through us. When people stand in the same places, breathing the same air, their own rhythms might awaken what's been waiting beneath the surface. The Black Hills are quiet, yes, but not still. Every gust, every echo from a distant thunderclap might be the world reminding itself of what it once endured. In that sense, haunting is only another word for resonance. The ghosts are not separate from the land. They are the language the land learned to speak. The last transmissions are never loud. They arrive thin and patient, static threads in the wind, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else has gone still. Sometimes it's just a click on the radio, a brief stutter in the signal. Other times it's a full phrase, carried through air that seems too empty to hold a voice. Hold the line. Advance by 2, fragments of an order that no longer belongs to anyone living. I've come to think the wraiths were never spirits at all, but the residue of language that refused to die. Men once spoke commands into storm and gunfire, their words striking the air like stones. Each syllable carried weight, duty, fear, belief. And when those men fell, the words remained, adrift, unfinished, circling endlessly above the soil that took them. What we hear now is not their return, but their endurance. The war to them never ended. The signal was simply left open. Across the hills, the sensors still blink in the same rhythm. The ranger's recorder still hums when the fog settles low. Even the hikers say their GPS units whisper coordinates into blank screens. Perhaps the transmissions travel through the rock or through us. Tiny fragments of commands still seeking acknowledgement. Maybe that's what ghosts have always been, unfinished messages waiting for a reply. And so, when the night is quiet and the wind slips down from the ridge, it's easy to imagine the last words of those forgotten patrols rising again through the static. Not as a plea, not even as memory, just a single voice checking in across a century of silence. Copy that, it says. Then the sound fades, static folding back into the wind, leaving only the pulse of the earth beneath it, steady and unbroken.